Okay, 6:31, the workshop is now called to order, meetings to call to order, and to open up with, we have a donation report.
Board, we have Ms. Jones has got a report to the question item, and we're able to do that few times. This is fairly important. Judy?
Good evening, Board of Trustees and guests. Just a special donation tonight, $129,624.55 from Apple Community Initiative to our school district.
Could you do that again in the microphone for me, please? Thank you.
Okay. Good evening, Mr. Chambers and Board. Donation for June 4th, a special donation tonight for $129,624.55 from Apple Community Education Initiative to 85 Speed.
Thank you for that. Now, Board, I'll entertain a motion to approve the donation. Okay, it's been moved by Ms. Rowe. Do I have a second?
I'll second.
It's been seconded by Ms. Butler. All in favor of approving the donation? Let the record show 6-0.
Thank you.
Mr. James, you want to add more?
Just real quick, this is a partnership that with the Houston Community College and Apple, obviously, for a coding curriculum that our students will be starting here in the fall. So it's, the upside on this is tremendous. And we appreciate Houston Community College and Apple for partnering with us. So thank you.
And thank you, as always, Ms. Jones, because I know that you have a hand in, linking this all together with everyone. So thank you for your assistance in, taking that donation on behalf of our students. We do appreciate it. All right, Board, before we go any further, I want to say that I'm going to make some changes to the agenda, just one change. We're going to have the next report up with my brother's keeper, but by request of the board member, we're going to go into executive session following that, if that's, no one has any issue with that. Okay, so we just want to make you guys aware of the change so the members in the room will be aware as well. Okay, at this time, the report on my brother's keeper.
Absolutely, and I do want to say one more thing about the Apple donation. We're of course very excited about that, and we do plan to share more specific detail with the board. We're just kind of under a non-disclosure for a lot of information, and as soon as Apple lets us know that it's okay to share the details, specific details, we will do so. Now, for the My Brother's Keeper Equity Intelligence Platform, Board, as you're very well aware, over the last several months, we've been having conversations with associates from the City of Houston and Bloomberg and Associates about an opportunity for us to partner with these two organizations, as well as a number of other host groups that are coming together for the purposes of trying to put together a platform that allows various entities to access real-time data. And so I'm going to, you've heard a little bit about it from me in board notes, but we thought it best to invite the people who are actually doing the work and trying to pull all our local agencies together to perform this. So we do have 3 individuals with us tonight. We have from Bloomberg and Associates, we have Neobli Armah, and we have Aaron Dalton. And then we also have Noel Pinnock, who's from the City of Houston Bureau of Youth and Adolescent Health Department. So without further ado, I think I'm going to turn it over to probably Noel. He's going to be first. I think they all want an opportunity to visit.
Absolutely. Thank you, Dr. Chambers and board members. Thank you so very much for giving us this opportunity to come out and really discuss to you guys a very, very prestigious movement in, I call the race of social justice in our community. I'm no stranger to the alien community. I was actually a transplant from New York. My father is a Jamaican, and when we first moved to Texas, we made A85 our home. And I was once a Chamber and Charger elementary school student before moving back to New York and coming back to Texas, and Houston in particular, and growing up in Sunnyside. So it's with great pleasure and humility that I bring to you guys this opportunity that was presented to us, and I'll not say us in an exclusive way, but the United States of America through the efforts of former President Barack Obama, who, after the tragic death of Trayvon Martin, said that we as a country must do what we can do to improve the outcomes for our young people, with particular focus on boys and young men of color, but not to exclude our young girls. My Brother's Keeper in the city of Houston has grown and has surmounted partners from across our agencies, many agencies, from health, education, employment, and justice, all working together to create safe and supportive communities. In fact, in Alief ISD alone, we have, through my bureau and our department, the Houston Health Department, under the direction of Stephen Williams, the director for the Health Department, and Mary Sylvester Turner, have implemented several programs that are supporting and directly impacting the Alief community. Number one is the crime prevention through environmental design, where we are actually going into communities, training young people in Alief schools on how we can prevent and reduce crime and violence through using an evidence-based program that will help clean up the blight and also increase the integrity that people experience when they live in Alief. The other piece of that is 4th We're working with our partners with UTMB and Galveston, training young people and teachers on how we can improve how they approach relationship building in the classroom. So it's math, arithmetic, writing, reading, and relationships. We know that none of us in this room would have gotten anywhere we want to be in our career had we not known what it took to build relationships. So when we talk about My Brother's Keeper, we're taking a social ecological approach to improving and increasing safe and supportive communities in the city as a whole, Alief and surrounding communities in the city of Houston. So when I tell you that this opportunity that will be presented to you is probably one of the most unique, I will also tell you that I had the pleasure of meeting with Barack and his staff in February, along with Bloomberg, and really touted how Houston is really at the forerunner, if you will, of this work centered around really building and expanding opportunities for young people so that they can achieve life's full potential. So the efforts that you're going to hear from our partners at Bloomberg and Associates is really going to be one that's not surprising to you, but I tell you what, it's going to be exciting for you, because it will be the first time in America where we are working across systems to bring in cold data that impact our people directly together on one single platform, really putting the city of Houston, Alief, in a position to be the first in the country to take this leap that will ensure that we work collectively, collaboratively, and more importantly, strategically and intentionally to ensure our young people and our families and communities are really achieving their full potential. So without further ado, thank you for indulging me for this moment. I'm going to turn it over to our partners in Bloomberg Associates with Naomi Armand. Please, thank you.
That's hard to follow. Good evening. I want to thank Superintendent Chambers and the board members for letting us present. Also, it's not ironic. I live in New York City. I work at Bloomberg Associates, but I'm a product of Alief. I'm a Mahaney, Albright, Elsa graduate, and so it's just an honor to stand in this room. Just to be back here to talk about this work and how important it is. What I want to unpack for you all is exactly what we're talking about. What is the Equity Intelligence Platform, and what will it do? And so we have a short presentation. Myself and my colleague Aaron are going to go through, and then we'll make sure that we leave time for questions. What I can just tell you real briefly, Bloomberg Associates, we are a nonprofit consulting firm that works with local government, both domestically and internationally. Michael Bloomberg, when he left office as being mayor of New York, he took a series of his deputy mayors, and it's 40 people, and literally what we do is try to improve quality of life for people on the ground. We don't work on national issues, we don't work on state issues, we are laser focused on municipal government and how do we better coalesce things happening in cities across the country. I spend 90% of my time working in cities that accepted the My Brother's Keeper Challenge, which was launched in 2014. And what I can tell you in the 5 years of doing that work, there are a number of programs that people present to help young people. tons of evidence-based programs. There are very few conversations in this country focused on collaboration. How do we get the systems as they exist today to better work to serve young people? So not a new program, but a new lens that helps young people succeed. And that's what the Equity Intelligence Platform is about. You know, our idea is that we need a tool to take data from disparate systems and put it in one place. The way the world is today, we look at high school graduation rates, we look at dropout rates, we look at truancy rates, someone will look up in the criminal justice system and look at crime rates. The problem with that is that what's happening to young people doesn't happen in silos. You know, they're not poor on Monday, mom loses their job on Wednesday, and then on Wednesday they're having trouble in school. The brunt of what happens to young people happens all at the same time. So how do we get our systems at the local level, both city, county, and government, to better collaborate to solve issues for these young people? And so the problems that the EIP is trying to solve is, one, is that we know in this technological age, there are tons of off-the-shelf tools that individuals can buy. There's a ton of companies that come to school districts and cities to sell them data dashboards, but the cost of those is really high, and the technology has never been more affordable. And so what we're thinking about is, how do we make a free tool that cities have access to, that if there's political will to share data, the rest can be done? And how do we actually remove the lags of, you know, usually an annual report of disparities is put out, but we pull data in real time. Like, why can't we intervene as soon as we know an issue is happening with young people? And so EIP is really trying to solve some of these historical issues, about solving issues, about making sure that data is available in real time. I'll tell you that the vision behind the Equity Intelligence Platform came from the work we were doing with cities around the country around issues around young men and boys of color, and really how do we make data come alive for that audience? So not using data to stigmatize young people, but actually using it to empower and change outcomes for them. And then our mission is really to organize and present data in a way that's really never been done. And so, you know, I was smiling when Noel said first in the country, but he's actually right. You know, there's very few places in the country, if any, that are using data this way. There's very many dashboards that exist. There's a ton of technology that exists, but I can tell you with confidence that very few places are integrating data at the local level in the way that we're talking about. Real quickly, I want to talk about a few core values. You know, this project originated, the city of Houston has been a long-time partner with Bloomberg Associates. We've worked in many other cities across the country, and there's a few things that we kind of have to demystify when we enter a conversation around young people. One is that we don't want to just build a tool and present to people. We want young people to help design what it looks like. We feel that they need to be at the center of this. Confidentiality and security is the most important thing, so that nothing about this dashboard will it make privacy concerns less important than they already are. I think systems level thinking is an important core value of this project, is that really understanding how do we change the systems that young people engage with. And then the last one is just inclusive. When you think about people who have power, lawyers, technologists, but then you think about people who work around collective impact tables, people who provide services to students, those people have to sit around the table together. You can't have someone make the legal decision and not take into the policy consideration, and you can't entertain technology that doesn't address privacy. And so this whole idea about how we've been building this, you know, we've been in Houston for a year working with the city and the county, and we're now talking to you. We've actually been working on the premise of this project for 3 years, making sure that before we ever stood in front of a body like this, that we crossed our T's and dotted our I's and made sure that both what we're proposing is legal, but that it's possible and it can actually work. It's really important to say that we've talked a lot about My Brother's Keeper, Young Men and Boys of Color. There's nothing about this tool that is only for that audience. That is the group that helped provide the idea, but the tool that we're designing will be for all young people. And so if the tool is built tomorrow and you only want to query Latino young women between the ages of 14 and 16, then you can do that. If you only want to query, you know, young white kids in 5th grade, or if you only want to query, you know, Asian kids, like it's designed with a targeted universalism approach to where we make sure that we're impacting where the disparity is, but that the approach is broad enough to where it can be applicable to all the diverse kids that are in this district and across the city. What are the 4 kind of primary features? And I'm not going fast on purpose, I'm going fast so that we can get to questions, because Aaron's going to follow me shortly. But I would say the four most important features when we talk about the Equity Intelligence Platform to keep in mind is the first is real-time and user-friendly. So as frequently as a data source indicator is captured, and as frequently as the leadership wants, that's when it can be displayed to the dashboard. And so we know standardized test scores happen a couple times a year, and so that's when it can be displayed to the dashboard. But things like attendance, that's a daily indicator. So depending upon the technology and the agreements, they can be agreed that within 48 hours, if there's a parent, a social worker who wants to know at the aggregated level attendance rates, then that can be made possible by this. I think user-friendly is really important in this conversation. I'm a practitioner, and so this is what I do for a living. I get on websites and look at data, but the same access that I have, a single-parent mother should have, or a person who works in an after-school program. And so we're not designing something for research purposes, we're actually designing it for the everyday citizen to get on and see what's happening in their neighborhood, because that's what this is about. It's about making data more accessible to everyone that cares about young people. Disaggregated, we could talk about that forever, but we should never in any instance look at data if it's not disaggregated by race, age, and geography. And this day and age is really, really important if you want to pinpoint where the change and intervention needs to happen. You have to disaggregate data. Longitudinal is another feature. We want to go back at a minimum of 5 years, but even longer. If we go back 10 years, we can actually start to see not just what's happening to the kids today, but what happened to the kids that left this district 6, 7 years ago. What trajectories are they on? And when you overlay the data that we're going to get from the Houston City, from the Harris County agencies, from the Houston agencies, we'll actually be able to see what is happening to folks long after they leave this district. And then I think the last feature I've talked about a lot, been integrated across systems. And so if you were to ask me, what is the single most feature that makes this different from everything else out there, is this last feature. It is integrated across systems. There's nothing about this dashboard when it's done when you go in and only see A-LEAF data. You're going to see a set of indicators from A-LEAF overlaid with a set of indicators from the Houston Health Department, overlaid with a set of indicators from the Houston Police Department, overlaid with a set of indicators from various county agencies, overlaid with a set of indicators from the Mental Health Authority. And so it's combining data so that we're looking at what's happening to young people across systems. I just can't emphasize enough how important it is to mention that we're integrating data across services, not at the individual level, but at the aggregate level. So this isn't about looking at what's happening to Noel, who's in 5th grade at Mahaney Elementary. It's about looking at what are the differences in 5th graders across the district and how they've interacted with other systems across the city. The framework that we built this around are on the 6 MBK milestones. And if you're not familiar with them, just real quickly, the first one is entering school ready to learn. The third is reading at a grade level by 3rd grade, graduating high school, college and career ready, post-secondary training, workforce, and then the 6th is reducing violence. And so there's 6 national MBK milestones, and we've correlated those with 42 indicators. And so the framework came from all the work done by the previous White House administration, which is now the Obama Foundation, but many, many other partners at the national level. And so I'm actually going to ask Aaron to come up as I close with my portion of the presentation. But just a lot of folks are like, well, why Houston? Why Harris County? Why A-LEAF? I can tell you after working in Oakland, in Baltimore, and Boston, there's a few unique things happening here that don't happen in other places in the country. Houston is the 4th largest city in America, but it's a small town. Everybody knows everyone here. And although there are barriers, the way that people are willing in this city to at least sit at a table together, it doesn't happen. There's cities in this country where folks from the municipality will not meet with folks from the county. It just won't happen. There were already relationships in place here. A-LEAF has already been a partner with the City of Houston Health Department. Harris County is already, like the partnerships and infrastructures were already here. And so in terms of like why here, it's because A, there's a sense of readiness. I would say the diversity in this district is just, we can't look at a better example of what the future of this country is going to look like. And so that's another reason we're here. And then lastly, there's just will here. There's a lot of folks who understand that if we can do something like this within the confines of the law, within the confines of technology, then why not? We've had meetings with the new county judge, with Mayor Turner, with Superintendent Chambers, and after they've asked us really, really hard questions, there hasn't been a shadow of a doubt why we would at least give this a pilot, which is what we're proposing to do here. And so with that said, I'm going to yield the rest of my time to Aaron Dalton, who's one of the experts in the country on integrated data systems, and then we'll take questions. But thank you.
Good evening, everybody. Thanks for having me. I'm not from A-Leaf. I didn't graduate from your fine school system. I have no references for the neighborhoods. So my references will actually come from Pittsburgh, Allegheny County, across the country. My day job, most of my time I spend as a deputy director at our Department of Human Services, and we have an integrated data system that we've been working on for the past 20 years. And so I'm passionate about, not as passionate as those guys, or I am, but I just can't pull it off the way they can, about seeing the kind of information we've been able to bring together for our community, our students, the people we work for. I'm passionate about seeing that happen in other places. So all my references will come from Pittsburgh and Allegheny. And I can tell you we've been integrating data with the school district since 2009, so 10 years, and have seen nothing but good outcomes from that, and have been integrating across system data for almost 20 years. And again, just a really powerful example of the kinds of things you can do. So I think the great part about this project is, for you guys, is you get to design it with us. So we've got some use cases up on the slide that have come from some of your partners at the Texas Criminal Justice Authority, the Harris County Courts and Juvenile Probation, some from you guys as well. So anything we're going to talk about, kind of the MBK indicators, are kind of starting points, but really this will be built to support your needs. So I'll give you some Allegheny County examples and then just highlight one or two of yours. So in Allegheny County, we've had this agreement with Pittsburgh Public Schools. Our largest school district is dwarfed by A-Leaf, so we have 26,000 kids in that school district, not the big size of A-Leaf, which feels smaller in Harris County perhaps. But we were able to integrate data, and we found that half the kids in Pittsburgh Public Schools were active in our human services at some point. 30% of those had child welfare involvement, another 30% involved in our mental health services. And this was really a call to action for us. How should these two child serving systems really be working together? And since then, we've done a lot of work together to improve outcomes, to identify kids experiencing homelessness, some of whom you might know about and the homeless providers don't, some of whom we know about and we don't have your list. So a number of really good outcomes from that. And similar to some of the interests that we've seen here from the criminal justice agencies, really trying to see what happens from school into juvenile justice and into the criminal justice system. We've done some of that work and found, shocking statistics for us that when kids start with a school arrest, nearly half have had an adult arrest and 30% experience a booking. But there are bright spots in that, places where we expected to see that pattern and didn't, and schools and programs that we think weren't well serving our kids. So working on stopping that earlier. So my point here is that these are the kinds of use questions that we come to Houston, Harris County, and A-Leaf with, but these are the kinds of things you guys get to drive the project forward with. So I won't go through these. This starts with the MBK milestones around education, housing, economic opportunity, health, violence. These are the kinds of indicators that nationally people are interested, many of which you'll be interested in here as well. But you get to help drive the things that get displayed and get analyzed. So let me just lay out a little bit about kind of the legal policy framework. So there's a charter, right? This is the partners coming together from the city, county, and school district who all agree to a set of rules that you will follow together in governing this work. Then there's the business associate agreement. This is more the relationship between each party and the tech vendor, BrightHive. Right, so here we're following your lead, taking a look at the agreements that you've typically used for data sharing partnerships in the past, and think we'll be able to make those work, but we need an agreement between you who will be sharing the data with the tech vendor and that tech vendor. And then lastly, BrightHive is the tech vendor that we're working with, who believes in a lot of the, or all of the same things we do, work done in the public domain, only working with public agencies, open source technology, affordable for scaling and so on. So let me, this I think is another slide that kind of just explains the relationship. So you've got the data trust, if you will, amongst the partners that are part of the partnership, and the various data source agencies. So ALEAF would be one of these data source agencies that's part of this broader governance board who's driving forward the entire project, all of the use cases with the local data. And I think actually, I'm going to use this slide to just kind of describe the way the information will be sent and used in the dashboards and platform that Noel and Yodley were talking about. And then if you have questions on any of the other slides, happy to walk through those. So, you know, once there's an approval to move forward, the data trust is complete. We work with your technology folks, and we've already had conversations with them in person today to provide the kind of student information that needs to come into the system so that they can be linked across the various systems. That data, the kind of personally identifiable information, will only reside with the other PII in order to create one ID for somebody. And will never be retained beyond that point. So it turns into something we call the master client index. That way you can find me across various data sets in order to produce the aggregate information. Separate from that is that kind of metric calculation engine. So those indicators, the things that you want to be seeing yourselves and displaying on the dashboard, that all gets done separately from the actual individual data. So those two things aren't touching, if you will. And then that data can then be visualized onto the platform, the Equity Intelligence platform, but also usable in any other platform ways that you guys want to use your local data. So it can go well beyond the kind of information that's in the platform you guys could be using as part of the trust. All right, so I think that might be enough of a kind of technical and data overview, and I think we're all happy to take questions.
The milestones that are listed in your packet look almost identical to the board's goals and directions, priorities that we want to have. And so when I was reading through that, it's amazing to me how well those blend together. My question is will ALEAF have someone in district to help manage the data that we will be receiving?
Short answer is yes. Charles will have to help you on the details.
So when we met, the relationship is Bloomberg with Bright Hive puts up and the Obama Foundation puts up the money to supply the database and the tools that are being held at Bright Hive. We submit data to them at a periodic basis, and so do all these other entities. Then this tool at Bright Hive mines the data together after it de-identifies the data so that you can't find, okay, this is Noel, you know, I found him, I know this is him, so that it de-identifies the data, and then it can be used along with the linkages that it makes with law enforcement, with the county health, and so forth. So we won't actually house any of this data. We're submitting our data to them like a TEA or a governmental entity that would be combining data together to come up with reports. And why the state of Texas hasn't done this before, I couldn't tell you, but bottom line is this is them as a philanthropic effort funding the entire program, and the city of Houston is on board, as well as the county and all these other entities, to make changes, to draw inferences over longitudinal periods using data that makes changes in policy in a good way. So it's not going to be something we're going to support, we're going to be housing, it's all that. It's going to be something that we can use once it's combined together as a school district to also work collaboratively with these other agencies to make changes for the better. So is that,
Yes, that's fine.
and we've looked all in through the data agreements and the sharing and the privacy and all that, FERPA, all that would be maintained and agreed to legally, and so Bloomberg does not want that on their record either, so it's as good as any other vendor we deal with data.
I can see this really working with the mental health initiatives that we want to take in the district to make sure all of our kids.
I think that's one of the first things we talked about, and that is a key part of this, that at least I was interested in terms of, you know, draw connections, connecting dots between kids and all these other issues they're dealing with. Perhaps, you know, a teacher in a classroom may know about simply because they just know the kid, but we don't know as an entity how to react to it. So,
I think it's a good leveraging of resources.
it's a long time coming.
I was actually going to say the same thing. I do think it's a very good leveraging of resources and being able to overlay our data with all the information from the county and different agencies. What I would like to see for us is if we're providing this data, I want to know how are we going to use it and have some type of framework or some type of strategic plan. If we're going to provide this information, how is it benefiting us? How are we using it to then change student outcomes, help support the district, not just providing our information to support other organizations in the work they do. Not that that's a problem, but that's what I would like to see. If we're providing this, what are we as a district are going to do with the
Well, and that would be the point of us even participating in this, is what are we going to do with this versus just have it at our fingertips. I don't think any of us can sit here right today and tell you exactly what that framework is going to look like, but that's the point of us getting involved in this, is to develop, first of all, once we see what's actually available to us, and then build, whether it's through commitments and beliefs and priorities, or whether it's just through learning something new that we've never had to address before, and creating relationships with other organizations we've never done before. Yes, ma'am, that would be the primary reason for us to participate in this, is what can we do with it now to help kids.
Exactly, and I'd like to add, just listening to what Aaron said, that they've been doing this in Pittsburgh, I believe, for 10 years, so that would be one of our first points of connection, is to connect with a district, an ISD, who's actually been involved in this. How have they used this data? So we wouldn't have to start from ground zero.
Even though it's Pittsburgh, we'll still.
So let me just add one more. I don't want to hijack, but in our discussions early on, we have the local entities, but we have another problem that we've been trying to deal with the city too, and we made a lot of headway that other parts of the city haven't already, is the information that's gathered during the census and getting better participation. And that right off the bat will help immensely in that effort, just having those two pieces of data together along with the census, because all of this, once it's geographically mapped, which it will be with this, we can do all kinds of reporting and what-if scenarios on why we're not getting the data from the census that matches what's really happening in A-Leaf. And so, because we're losing out on a lot of dollars. So,
the only question I have is, sounds like a great program, and I do agree that Houston's an area where currently sources communicate. I know we have a natural disaster or some emergency happen, like Harvey. Everybody pretty much open our books and work together and set the table and see what's the better for Houston and the surrounding areas. It wasn't, well, that's a county issue, that's a city issue, that's a district issue. It's all kind of like this, what do we do for the people of Houston? And so I agree that that's a good plan. I do have concerns, the same thing with Ms. Brewer mentioned about, what are we going to use with the data and how are we going to use that? And from experience, I know y'all kind of like probably dug deep into it, took the statistics and going, how could this help at a campus level? If I was an administrator, how could this help me? Not particularly Noel, but fifth graders, boys of color, issues with that compared to other campuses, with other districts, and with some of the issues that they face. I guess that's where we come up with some of the other districts and issues. I just hate, of course, it's not costing us anything except for manpower to send the data in and put the time together to get the data. But I just hate for us to do all this work and then come back with a bunch of data like, okay, what are we going to do with this? And it gets put away, there's been a couple of times that we've had some programs like that.
And I see it kind of very similar to risk loads, kind of using, the information to help us plan better. We're able to actually see, and, not only risk loads data, but also this data to say, okay, where are, we experiencing, maybe in one part of the district, we're seeing just a spike in some of our students who are involved in the, mental health system. And so that would be a huge help. So we may, that may have implications for our guidance and counseling department and the type of support that we give at that campus or in that particular area. So those are the types of things that we're thinking about.
Maybe, I do think there's a lot of operational uses of this kind of information once that kind of trust is set up. So we are able to move, I work for the agency that provides the mental health student support systems to schools. And we can see where to put those resources based on the classes and where kids are going to school and if things are getting, sort of better in this area or not. One thing we actually haven't done, but we've talked about very operational, is by the time the kid's in 4th grade, maybe how to do how to make classroom assignments, but kindergartners, you don't know who's coming into kindergarten. We could, even those kinds of things, you could use the data and the links with human services to help arrange classrooms so you have a better mix of kids across classrooms. And then, maybe you want to comment on this too. I don't think any of the other partners intend, they're interested in this and being first and being part of a national movement here, but I definitely think the city and the county partners intend to use this information to help local work. So I think there's been discussions about kind of putting analysts around this to do some more, deeper dives to do the kind of work that you're talking about.
You already have the agreements with the other entities, the city, the county, things like that, or are you still in the process of securing those as well?
Yep, so it's going before Commissioner's Court by the end of June, in the same time frame for the city. So our goal is to have all the agreements lined up by the end of June.
That makes a big difference. If you got this pie, and you only got 2 slices of pie, that's not, it's not a very good pie.
100%.
So
It has to be all three.
it has to be
And
all.
I know Noel's going to comment on the piece about what to use with the data. One of the things that's going to accompany the data tool is actually the change management toolkit. And so one of the things, or one of the frustrations that we had that helped embody this work is that for the most part, when you're in a city that has a collective impact table, let's take, for example, if you're familiar with the mayor's Complete Communities neighborhood. Maybe Noel can speak to it, but you always ask the question, well, how did you choose those communities? And what our theory of change is that tools like this will completely take the discourse away and we'll be able to laser focus on where the need is the highest, where the disparity is the most. And so one thing I would say, just as an outsider, is if you think about all the ancillary wraparound support that happens across the district, how do you decide where those supports go? How do you decide if there's a guy that comes in and says, I want to be a mentor to the district? Usually we rely on conventional wisdom. Where's there a principal who's going to collaborate? Where do we have good staff support services? We actually think data should be driving all of these decisions. And so we're going to build a toolkit that teaches systems, because this is why disparities exist. It's not because there's someone in a room who hates a certain population. It's because our systems aren't making decisions based on data and based on facts. And so this is hopefully going to start to be part of that process to where even though you do have to take into consideration other things, but how do we laser focus on where the data is driving us, where we know the change is the most.
Thank you, sir.
You're welcome.
Let's go with you. But let me kind of put another layer. There's 2 schools of thoughts about data, and one of which our team really hates it, and that if you torture data long enough, it will confess to anything. But the other school of thought is that in God we trust, the rest show data. Right? And in the city of Houston and surrounding areas, there are over 460,000 young people between the ages of 10 to 24. That is the equivalent of the size of the city of Atlanta. If I tell you right now that in the city of Houston, our population in the jail is about 9,000. And most people are in the jail system right now either because they have mental health issues, poverty, or drug abuse, substance abuse. If I then overlay that and tell you that if you look at any school district and you find out 50% of your student population have one or more parents in the jail system, then you're looking at a 70% likelihood of those 50% young people who will likely find themselves incarcerated. I ask, how do we then define the strategy to address those young people who are oftentimes anonymous to all of us in our schools? Because no one wakes up in the morning and says, well, I gotta go tell Mrs. Burrow that, my mom just got in jail. But we don't see the child. The child is obviously probably engaged in some type of devious misconduct. They're no longer in school, and worse yet, they drop out. But nobody knows. But what if we can drill down to that zip code level and say that we can identify a pocket of young people who have parents who are incarcerated at the aggregated level and say, you know what, let us design programs that work in concert with our police department who are oftentimes engaged in preventative work, not just arrest work, looking to ensure that we provide pathways to success for our young people. So from a complete communities perspective, as Naomi said, we are looking at pockets of opportunity. But oftentimes when we're designing programming, when we're designing these really new, cool things, we're looking at data that's almost a year, sometimes 2 years old. Trying to solve problems, and Albert Einstein said it best, we cannot solve yesterday's problems at the same level of thinking we were at when we created them. So when we say that this is a tool that can be operationalized and leveraged, my last point is that we will my existence will have a governance body whose conversations at the collective table is how do we best utilize the data across systems. Right? There are two schools of thoughts about the village concept. We all know, we're all educated. I was in education for 20 years. I've been in government for almost 30. I know I look young. But let me tell you, they always say it takes a village to raise a child or a community. But ask yourself two questions that oftentimes go unasked and unanswered. Who trains the village? And who in the village is invited to the training? What this does, it brings the village to the table so that we can work collectively and intentionally create these intersectionalities that will afford everybody that's in the business of blessing people and communities and giving them the tools to do so with accuracy and intentionality. And that's just not passion, that's what I do every day. My responsibility is the chief of the Bureau of Youth and Adolescent Health, and I am the custodian, if you will, of 460,000 young people. And I don't touch them all at one time, but with efforts like this, we can touch them one at a time.
Well, that leaves nothing for me. You guys have answered it all. Thank you for that round two. I really appreciate that. I have one thing that was brought to my attention with all of that loveliness that you guys brought along. We hope to have the Obamas come and, champion us. Yeah. We know, just say that for later. We know that you can make it happen. We just want to let you know ahead of time we are in agreement with that. Okay? Thank you.
And I'm sorry, Ms. Williams, just know that, certainly we are prepared to put the agreement for the board to have on the June 18th agenda. Thank you.
All right. And board, I asked Mr. Chambers to kind of share with us what that would look like. This is simply an MOU, so it's something where we, like an initiative to have to vote on. So, but just look forward to receiving that information. That's coming up soon. So when it comes forth, if you guys, like Mr. Moreno typically does, want to do a formal, since this is such a big deal, we may want to do a formal, we all agree, kind of an event. Okay? Thank you. Is there anything else? Thank you guys so very much for your awesome presentation and great words.
Appreciate it.
All right. At this time, board, I'm going to ask that we take a moment to go into executive session based upon section 551.071 for the purpose of private consultation with board attorney on any and all subject matters. And the rest of you can take a break, and we're going to come out and check hands real quick before we Thank you, Craig, I appreciate your assistance. Thank you, Ms. Pepper, for hanging in there with us. And Ms. Barbara and everybody. Okay, we are reconvened at 8:32. I gave the superintendent some specific duties, so you guys can go ahead and get started. I'm pretty sure he heard your presentation already.
Okay, board,
And just for the record, we're going to go ahead and move towards the budget planning for 1920. Thank you, Charles.
yes, ma'am, I'm going to change the, if I can, the PowerPoint order within these two agenda items, because I think we decided that it would make more sense first to kind of go over the legislative update, in particular reference to a couple of bills that we're going to be utilizing in the budget discussion. So I want to first go over those again. So if you could lower the lights. I updated this from the time I gave you a legislative update before, just how many bills were actually passed in the end in the session compared to previous years. I included the legislative priorities of the school district so that we could reference the changes that did occur in law, both on the accountability side with continuation of IGCs, dual credit, the CCMR measurements, and also on the funding side, meeting economically disadvantaged ELL and highly mobile, the expectations that we had for the 60/30 Texas plan and House Bill 5, House Bill 22, and the changes there. So, specifically, there was no talk about vouchers this session, and we did make a little bit of headway with funding from the perspective of districts like ours, but overall, I think that there's a there's a large change that occurred that everybody's going to be dealing with, and that is the fact that there really is no growth left in the school finance formula anymore without going through for a TRE anymore. And I'm going to explain how that works. The finance bills that passed, Senate Bill 500 is a supplementary bill. I've talked about that before, to back fund the holes from the previous legislative session. But there's three main bills I want to talk about on school finance. Senate Bill 12, which is propping up TRS and making it actuarially sound within a 29-year payout instead of 87 years, I think it currently is. So if the state went belly up and they had to pay out, then it would take 29 years to pay out the number of people who are currently retired in the system. Whereas today, it would take 87 years. So they don't have enough money to make that happen. So the goal was to build up the fund. So luckily they didn't ask more of school districts in contributions or employees, but the state is kicking in considerably more with Senate Bill 12. They also are offering a 13th check to be determined later. I don't know the timing, but if you retire prior to December 31st, 2018, you will get your normal monthly annuity up to $2,000. If it's over $2,000, you won't get any more. So be paying attention to TRS for information about that. But they haven't done one of those in a number of years either. I think it was 2007 was the last one. But so TRS was not under attack to get turned into a defined contribution plan. TRS was helped and propped up in this session, which is good. It was officially said multiple times, this is a good system, we're going to protect it, we're going to add more money to it. So it was a different approach to TRS and protecting it for our employees from this session. So that's a great thing. House Bill 3, that's the school funding bill. I'm going to explain here in just a minute, but that goes hand in hand with Senate Bill 2. Okay, so House Bill 3 defines the funding formula. Senate Bill 2 is a tax cap bill. Okay, so I'm going to explain this another day. If you're into school funding elements, Deanna's going to describe this, but I've updated these. These are every piece of the school funding formula changed. But as I said before, when it was still in committee, there's two basic changes that occurred that affected Alief and other districts surrounding us in the Houston area. One of which, the biggest, is the basic allotment was increased. Basic allotment is the foundation school program entitlement for every student. I don't care what property rich, property poor, what district you're in. It went from $5,140 to $6,160. It was a $1,020 increase, which approximately is 20% increase.
Let me ask real quick, is this across the board or is this Alief specific?
These are across the board, but I've tried to put what that means to Alief in parentheses at the end of each sentence there.
Okay, that helps, thanks.
Okay. They added the dollars for the summer slide, or the 30 days of half-day funding for campuses that are kinder through 5th. So that exists as an option for Alief to use. They changed the yields for every penny we charged in Tier 2, which are called the golden and copper pennies, if you remember us talking about those. And they're no longer indexed to Austin ISD property values anymore. They're indexed to the basic allotment. So the only time they'll ever increase in the future is if the legislature raises the basic allotment. Whereas before, we were used to, if Austin was getting property value rises, we were benefiting from that, as were the rest of the state. That's not gonna happen anymore. So now we're set for each biennium. Also, they compressed Tier 1 tax rates, 7 cents. So for us, goes from $1 is your Tier 1 tax rate, and become 93 cents for Alief taxpayers. The Tier 2 tax rate is also becoming a compressed number in this, that is part of, they moved the gains from Austin yield to these indexed off the basic allotment, and at the same time made sure that they lowered the Tier 2 tax rate so by the amount of that gain. So in other words, we raise the amount you're going to get in Tier 2, but drop the tax rate in Tier 2 so the taxpayer sees the benefit, okay? One of the largest changes in this whole thing is the very first bullet, which is the cost of education index goes away. That was $3 billion statewide. They went back into the system or the pot of dollars to reallocate. For us, that was a 16% weight applied to every dollar in the basic allotment. That's gone. So for us, that was roughly $35 million loss. But then, by raising the basic allotment, we got it all back. Now, the problem is that allocating the money, they raised the allotment that would be given for compensatory education, and that is for economically disadvantaged. They raised the allotment for bilingual, dual language portion of bilingual, and then added the early reading allotment. So I want to stress that Alief benefits a lot, or greatly, from the change to increasing the allotments for compensatory ed or for economically disadvantaged, whereas some of our neighbors don't. Okay? So when we look at it from a tax rate perspective, I've tried to demonstrate the difference on this graph, just so you can have this. The ultimate part of this laser, the ultimate part of this to point out is the far right total. Currently, our M&O rate is $1.12 and a half. We had a tax ratification election in 2008 that raised our tax rate from $1.04 to, which was statutorily allowed as your minimum tax rate at that time. We raised it 8.5 cents. The voters approved it to $1.12 and a half. It's been sitting there ever since. The tax compression that they put into the base finance formula will lower our M&O tax rate to $1.39175. So it virtually takes that 8.5 cents back out of the tax rate, just over 8 cents. That's great for any taxpayers. The state makes up those dollars difference that we lose from dropping that rate, okay? So this is the breakdown of which portions, the golden and the copper pennies, and the math behind it. And unless you really want to go into this, I can, but I think what we want to get to is the effects of what this does to our budget. So everybody, and I say everybody in the state, is dealing with this compression, got some compression out of House Bill 3. So not just Alief. The fact that yields differ between districts based on how many pennies they were assessing. If they had a TRE or not before, they might see a greater drop or a lesser drop in their tax rate for their taxpayers. We had a TRE for 8.5 cents, so it was a pretty good drop that we received, our taxpayers received from that compression. The second part of compression, which I was talking about in Senate Bill 2, comes in the subsequent years. So now we understand that we have a tax rate at $1.39751, and going forward, that rate will not change unless, starting in 2021, this board decides we want to have another TRE, or unless the state compresses it more. The state will compress it more if the property values of the district rise greater than 2.5%, 2.5% in dollars revenue that we would receive. If that occurs, then our tier 1 rate, that 93 cents, will continue to get crushed or compressed farther by the amount of that gain. So the only amount of gain we will get, and we won't get it, the state will get it, is 2.5%. So now, from this point forward, it's the state's money or local taxpayers' money. A-Leaf doesn't get any, okay? It's just how much the state pays, it makes up the difference, versus the local taxpayer. So if values rise greater than 2.5 cents, the state's going to force the rate down to a point where it's only 2.5% growth, and the state makes up the difference. So the state will still be able to lower its share by 2.5% every year across the state. So it doesn't totally fix this problem where the state pays less and less, but at the same time, because property values rise so high in the state and so fast, it's going to cost the state of Texas at least $1 billion a year, 2 years out, and go up from there. Because it's not in statute a way to pay for this.
That's the dark little secret people need to pay attention to. Is the year 21, 22, 23, these $1 billion a year kind of begin accumulating. And I would expect in 2023 for that particular session is going to be a difficult session because the state will have to make up somehow anywhere from $5 to $7 billion that's created with this hole with the revenue cap. So if you're here 7 years from now or 5 years from now, it's going to be an issue that's going to be dealt with.
So our taxpayers, not on the debt service side, it's just the M&O side. I know we set the tax rate at budget time at the end of August, right? And so you still have to make that decision and have to vote on it, but you don't really have any input, okay? Just let you know. The law says now, this is the math to calculate your tax rate. You really don't have any input into that. So, unless you order a TRE, which you can't do for a whole year.
Charlie, what's TRA stand for?
Tax ratification election. So basically, it's an election, it's kind of like the old rollback election. It's an election to raise your taxes.
I think unfortunately, Charles, the problem is going to be is if the board has power, people won't understand. It will look as if we actually take power on something that the legislators put in motion on our behalf.
Yeah, if you still have to make vote.
The vote, yes, but the changes in finances on behalf of the taxpayer, no.
No, so, yeah, virtually, the rudder's not in your hands.
It's almost like
It's
having
like a statewide tax rate, if you ask me.
Okay.
Now, the way it currently reads, it benefits the taxpayers. So that's good, except that we just don't grow anymore. The state gets the benefit from the growth. All right, a couple of other bills I want to point you to. Under school safety, we had Senate Bill 11. That's the one that's gotten the most discussion. And really, I want you to know, after reading through it and all, we are really doing, I think, a lot of these things already. And so this just brings the rest of the state into compliance. Providing telephones, communication devices, mandatory drills, so forth, inventories. It does provide $100 million in budget for grants, and those grant funds can be used for a lot of things, but hopefully for mental health, which we could apply for. So we're keeping our eye peeled for that. The remainder of these aren't particularly interesting or effective, but I just wanted you to know that these were the biggest ones that were sent. The nurses can now provide asthma medicine to a student if they have parents' written permission. And there is Under accountability, there's a couple of interesting ones where Cole Course Bill, Senate Bill 1306, where we've got to post on our website who the contact information for the campus behavior coordinator is. I don't know why that was a problem, but that's not a big deal. Compliance with dyslexia screenings, because now there's a dyslexia allotment. Paxton bill passed. Posthumous high school diplomas, Capriglione bill. And then finally, the last one we just talked about tonight, changes the definition of at-risk as a student whose parent has been incarcerated or is in a penal institution, becomes also now at risk. Was timely. So on core accountability, 3906 is the bill to discuss, House Bill 3906, and this was the largest amount of changes for accountability. So I want to let Ava describe it.
Yes, just real quickly, really, Chairman Huberty, the message behind this bill was really just, it was written to eliminate all the stress surrounding, the STAR test. So I know we've heard plenty about that. We did provide the board with a detailed kind of handout on, the changes that were made and the legislative intent, so you have that at your tables. But a few things that I want to highlight is that the assessment is changing to be as short as, I don't want to say possible, they're using the word practicable. So they are looking to minimize the disruption in the educational setting. So they're looking at shorter tests, somewhere between 60 to 75 minutes at a time. In addition, some of the other changes are that they are eliminating the 4th and 7th grade STAR writing test. And the plan is to look at embedding sort of a short answer response in the 3rd through 8th grade assessments, but just kind of doing away from the standalone 4 to 7 writing test. There are a few other key things here that I think you guys should know about. They are prohibiting things like giving STAR on Mondays, beginning of the week. If the beginning of the week happens to be Tuesday because Monday's a holiday, you can't give it there. In addition, they are limiting the number of the percent of multiple choice questions to 75%. As they're working through all of these changes, one of the things that TEA will be required to do is they are being required to establish educator support committees and technical support committees to kind of get all these things done, because in addition to the changes that are listed there, they're also looking at the assessment being online, so going to online by the year 2022-23. So there's lots of changes here in that bill, and so we are still working through that, and we'll be working very closely and hope to be part of the conversation, sending our accountability folks, our tech folks, to actually give good input and guidance as we can.
Okay, and then finally, on some other bills of different focus, I want to point out that House Bill 2820 passed, which removes TRS from being the mandatory fund registrar for 403B fund companies. Now that's a problem in a couple of different ways, but ultimately it's worrisome that now there's really not any regulatory authority other than the SEC over that. And so there are some funds that are not the best for people thinking about long-term retirement, and there's really not anybody safeguarding that now. So people are going to, retirees and active contributors are going to need to consult and trust their financial advisors who they work with, because the TRS won't be looking over it anymore. And then the endorsements, Senate Bill 1276, to align those with dual credit, post-secondary pathways. That's all just trying to make post-secondary work better with HB5 and all the work we've been doing with CCMR, so those are all positive. And 1376 would repeal other copy of a contract between the school district and the bank selected as a district depository, and a copy of the depository's bond to be filed with TEA. They're gonna lighten some restrictions that we've talked about in the past, where they don't really, they just file it. It was a mandatory in old law, so they stripped some of that stuff out. So, now I can go back to the finance, but I think what Deanna now is gonna go over is kind of the budget, and where it sits with House Bill 3, and what the key pieces are with regard to mandatory staff raises and kind of where we're sitting with our numbers going from 18, 19, 19, 20. So, but
Can I make one comment?
yes.
I saw an article in Houston Chronicle last Wednesday, and I just wanted to bring it up, that ALEC is getting about $844 per student.
So that's not,
Not strictly.
there's a whole lot of misinformation out there right now. So that is comparing next year current law to new law. That's not comparing how much more it's going to be from this year to next year using current law to new law across the span of 2 years. Yes, if you look at what we would have gotten in 1920 versus what we're going to get in 1920, that's the difference, $844.
And we did better than most school
And that's
districts in the area.
That's based on an estimate that the Legislative Budget Board did, who works for the legislature as an estimator. It's not our
That
numbers.
article is only Pasadena who's getting more dollars than we are
So,
in this area.
so there's lots of reasons for that estimating. One is that they made some assumptions on economically disadvantaged census block information, and they had to do that across the entire state. And what they did was they used the address of the school, not of all the kids, because they don't have all that. So they had to make some quick, rough estimates.
The simple answer is yes, and we did very well.
Oh, sorry, I went a long way around.
No, I'm just, they did very well for a lot of reasons. One in particular, I think it's important for everyone to understand, is this whole idea of redefining economically disadvantaged and comp ed. And so one of the things we pushed really hard for is to redefine our kids, not just our kids, but kids who come from low income, kids who don't speak the English language, and these other factors that have never been considered as a part of the money following the kid. And that's essentially what's happening now. I mean, if you could boil this down to a simple language term, the money now, the majority of the money is following the students who need it the most based on a variety of factors. Some of it's census data, but that's trying to take into account for income, single family, all these factors that go into what we would consider to be at-risk factors for the kids. That's why the ALEFs, you're going to see ALEF in Pasadena and all the districts who are similar to us, you'll see them with greater increases in the next club. And it was the right thing to do.
I think the only, while it was an article, the only issue I have with articles like that is they try to write the narrative for us rather than allow us to be the one to dictate. You know, it's like when they first came out and said that everyone would receive $5,000. That has gone into the minds of people, and so when their districts is not able to give the money they thought, then it's going to come back on the district. Why didn't you do what the state said? Unless understanding what really happened. You know, so I like the fact that the articles go out there and they try to champion us to, you know, have done very well, but at the end of the day, they are still trying to write a narrative for us that we haven't even gotten finalization on what that would look like for us.
Yeah, so there's estimates that were done by multiple sources, and then, yeah, there's been lots of analysis done as to what this did statewide, but as HD said, districts who are high economically disadvantaged, high bilingual or ELL populations did better than the average, and districts who are Chapter 41 or their Robin Hood, their recapture payments had grown out of control, they did well too, because they were headed for a crash course of you know, financial insolvency within a few years because they just couldn't make those payments anymore. So with everybody on the fringe that is urban, suburban, not rural, but around the fringe of large metropolitan areas who aren't high economically disadvantaged, didn't do so well. So districts like Fort Bend, Katy, they didn't get near as much Cyfair, didn't get near as much per student. So that, as he said, that's because the money is more allocated by population factors than by property value. Okay? So the thing to remember is taxpayers getting a break, that's great. That helps our taxpayers. They're kind of held at a 2.5% cap on how much they're going to have to spend. Even if their values rise, that's great. We just got to figure out, the legislature's got to figure out when they meet again, how they're going to pay for it. But we love it. We love it, yeah. All right.
Good evening. Charles and I have been working on these numbers hard in the last week since this legislation passed in the House and the Senate. So these are our best estimates based on what we know now. So we're reading information from CASBO and the Equity Center and the School Alliance, and we're looking at their runs and comparing their numbers to now our own internally generated numbers based on the changes in the law, and trying to make the best estimates we can as we start moving forward on decisions. There are still a lot of unknowns. There are a lot of things that we're going to know more about as time goes on, but we feel like we have pretty solid estimates to start discussing with you. So very quick reminder of our current year projections. We covered this in a lot of detail at the May meeting. We're currently working on updating projections for end of month May. Our May numbers were based on end of month April. We don't expect significant changes. So we are projecting a loss of about $5 million for this current year, and we again discussed the reasons for that previously. So this is the starting point for our 1920 budget. We always start with our estimated revenue from the current year and our estimated expenditures, and explain to the board changes in each of those factors. So if we had not received any additional revenue, we would have been looking at reducing our expenditure budget by $5 million to avoid that continuing loss. Another way to look at it would be that first $5 million in additional revenue that we received needs to go to cover our current expenditure levels. So, looking at the revenue projections, and this kind of summarizes a lot of what Charles just covered in his presentation with our best ALEAF specific numbers. So, starting with our projected revenue for 18-19 and applying all the different changes, we're estimating about a $51 million increase in state foundation program revenue. So this is our formula revenue from the state. Regular program allotment increases due to the change in the basic allotment, but that's offset by that reduction in the elimination of the CEI. Special education funding, we were already estimating an increase of about $1.5 million due to additional students in special ed. That number is now $4.2 million. That includes the new dyslexia allotment and includes an additional weighting for our mainstream kids, as well as the increase in the basic allotment increases all of these other allotments also. CTE is increasing because of the basic allotment. Would already have increased because of additional FTEs we were projecting, but also we're now able to receive CTE funding for our middle school kids. And we've received some estimates on the increases for that.
I'm so excited.
Yeah, great news there. The gifted and talented allotment is going away. That does not mean that we're not still required to spend or to have the same programs available in gifted and talented. We have to certify to the commissioner that we've met the requirements. It's just no longer a separate allotment.
It's in the basic allotment.
It's rolled into the basic allotment, and then we just certify we're still providing required services. For compensatory education, this is the big one that Charles was discussing. So the The funding for Comp Ed is no longer tied to our free and reduced lunch count. It's economically disadvantaged students and then broken into these various census blocks. So we're waiting for additional information from TEA on that, so we're kind of conservatively estimating that number right now. The weights go from 0.225 now to 0.275, and we're estimating that we'll fall somewhere in the 0.25. Our consultants had used an estimate of like 0.256. The LBB was using different estimates also. So our best estimate is an increase of 16.2 million there. The bilingual allotment is estimated to go up about 1.8 million. That does now include additional funding for students that are in a dual language program that are bilingual. It also includes funding for students that are non-LEP students that we're serving in the dual language program. So we've got our counts of students we're currently serving in those different arrangements, and overall increase of about 1.8. This early education bucket, the 12.5 million, that's completely new source of funding for school districts, and that's based on the number of economically disadvantaged or limited English kids that are in K through 3. The intention with these additional funds is that it will be used to fund a full-day pre-K program in the future. I believe it's stated in the law that districts have 6 years to if you don't have the capacity right now to implement full day, to move towards that, and this is funding for that. The high school allotment has gone away. That was rolled into the basic allotment also. There's a new source of funding called the College Career Military Ready Outcomes Bonus. That's additional funding for districts who meet criteria for CCMR in numbers that exceed a threshold rate to be set by the commissioner. So we don't have that threshold rate yet. We used estimates kind of based on the data that LBB was using also to come up with about $1 million increase. So for those students that meet criteria above the threshold, it's a $5,000 bonus if they're ECO-DIS, $3,000 for non-ECO-DIS, and $2,000 for special ed. The staff allotment goes away, that was repealed, and then our local share is going down about $2.3 million. So that's several things affecting that local share. Our local share would have gone up a lot because of the increase in our prior year property value. This is now based on current year value, which Charles had talked about the way there's no longer that property value lag where the district benefits for 1 year from increases in property values. In the same year, they're using that increased property value to determine your local share and reduce your state funding. So we have a slight decrease in that local share because of using current year values, but then compressing that tax rate, the Tier 1 tax rate, from $1 down to 93 cents. Then in Tier 2, our funding is estimated to go up $6.5 million. And that is the switch that he was also talking about, and now there's 8 golden pennies instead of 6 golden pennies. There's a reduction in the copper pennies, as well as a reduction in the yield. But overall, going up about 6.5 million. Under old law, Tier 2 was going up about 7.5 million. So this really isn't a gain, old law to new law. So overall, increase from all these various factors, about $51 million.
I have just one question.
Uh-huh.
Maybe you have an answer. So under special education, you said that that covers the dyslexia allotment as well. Does that cover dyslexic kids that are not in special ed?
That's a separate allotment. There's a separate allotment for dyslexia that's not special ed. And the special ed allotment increase was 5% across the board on mainstream because of the state's lack of effort, maintenance of effort. So that was an amendment that a House member got put on the last minute to say, send the money to the districts. So
Yeah, I rolled the dyslexia allotment into special ed, but it's for any student identified as dyslexic, whether they're special ed or not.
Okay.
Probably shouldn't have rolled that in now that you raised the question.
And the local share,
Mm-hmm.
because they changed it to current year, we lost almost $2.3 million. But that won't be a recurrent loss. I may not be stating
The
that right.
change in the local share was mainly caused by compressing that tax rate from $1 down to 93 cents.
And you said that.
Yeah, but switching it to current year values cost us money in the local share.
Yeah, we lost
So
$10.5
it's
million
offset.
for the move to current year values. And then from that change that they made, they raised the basic allotment even more, another $140. So we got 2/3 of it back for that take that they made that last minute change to move to the current year values. So
The state originally wanted to use the current year value that they were going to, that was going to benefit the state for additional property tax compression. And there was a pretty serious fight behind closed doors about where that money goes. And the school folks, so it was put back in, for the most part, put back in public ed.
And Roger, you get another one of these projects and get that.
And that's where if you recall, that's when the sales tax was being discussed, the increase in the sales tax swap, and some of our leaders thought that was going to be the solution to not being able to use the money they could generate from the current year values, but that at a very quick death. And to this point out, what's going to happen in 3 to 5 years, without an additional influx of revenue to the state's going to have to make some decisions in 3 to 5 years.
So before we start spending the $51 million, let's continue on a little bit, because that's just one piece of the change in our revenue from 18-19 to 19-20. So you can see that foundation revenue change there of $50 million. Local revenue, however, is going down about $1.3 million. So our increase in value for this current year was 7.35%. With our tax rate of $1.12.5, if we were allowed to keep that tax rate, that would have generated about $2 million. But because they're requiring us to compress our tax rate and save our taxpayers money down to $1.39175, tax revenue will actually reduce from last year to this year by $1.3 million. So the House Bill 3 changes took away that increase in local tax revenue that we would have seen in the current year. The other change is that we file audits with TEA through the Comptroller's Office whenever there are changes to our property tax rolls after they've already calculated our state funding, and they go back and recalculate our state funding as if our value had been at that lower amount. We've had some pretty big settlements on those for the last several years, mainly due to the big court settlement with Shell. So this year we received about $6 million in those prior year settlements. We don't anticipate receiving any large amounts for next year. So that bucket of revenue is anticipated to reduce next year. So overall, the change in state, local, and then these prior year property value audits brings us to about $43.4 million in additional revenue. So then, let's move on to expenditure changes. If we start with our projected expenditures for the current year and adjust for things that we know are increasing for next year already, all of our department directors and campuses have input their budget information. We've actually been pretty sidetracked with really studying staffing plan changes as well as these law changes. So with that 10% of our budget that's in non-payroll, we'll continue to review over the next several months as we move towards budget adoption in August. But what we do know at this point, payroll and related expenditures expected to go up about $4.1 million. So that's two factors that are influencing that, and that's without a salary increase. So the first one is when they remove that cost of education index, it reduced our state funding, but it also changes the amount that we pay in the TRS for employees that were paying above the statutory minimum. So we used to get credit for that 16% bump with the CEI in our statutory minimum payments. So we no longer will receive that, so that's about $2 million. Our staffing plan changes that we reviewed at the last several meetings, if you'll remember, that was kind of a break-even point on what we were increasing in staffing, was primarily covered by increases in revenue. Well, now, because we're showing kind of the revenue changes separately and the expenditures changes separately, those increases in revenue are built into the revenue numbers, and this is the increase in the staffing plan numbers. So for example, special ed, we added a lot of special ed teachers and paraprofessionals because of our increase in students. At the same time, our revenue is going up for those increases in students. So we've been netting those all along, but now I'm showing them in two separate places. Same numbers, just a different presentation. And then our non-payroll expenditures are relatively flat, except you'll remember last year, due to our budget constraints, we spent $750,000 out of the technology expenditures from the IMA fund rather than from the general fund. We knew that was a one-time thing. We couldn't afford to do that going forward, so now those expenditures are moving back to the general fund. So with those factors right now, that's about a $5.1 million increase in expenditures. So putting it all together, if we look at our estimated 1920 revenue of 467.7, subtract out those baseline expenditures that do include $5.1 million in increases, the remaining amount that we have available would be $33.2 million. So in conversations, of course, with Mr. Chambers over the last few days, he's like, well, where'd the $50 million go? How's the $50 million now $33 million? So I've broken out those changes in the box on the right there. So the increase just in state foundation was the $51 million. Remember, we said we first have to cover the loss we have in this current year, about $5 million. We won't be receiving those big property value settlements next year. That's about $6 million. Local revenue going down about 1.3, and then the increase that we've identified in our baseline expenditures. So that leaves us with $33.2 million. Again, like Charles was saying, we have to keep in mind that there's no longer any built-in revenue increases in subsequent years. The property value lag is gone. The automatic increase in Tier 2 guilds is gone. So when we estimate revenue in 2021, it's going to be about the same as 1920. We need to reserve funds for the expansion of full-day pre-K in the future. Our estimated staffing cost for that is about $6 million. So we don't want to begin to spend those funds now on recurring costs and then not have those funds available when we're ready to expand further on full-day pre-K. And then again, like I said at the very beginning, funding estimates are still somewhat tentative at this point. We're waiting for guidance from TEA and further refinement of our numbers. So, talking about salary considerations. And this kind of gets to your question, Jennifer, about all these different numbers that are floating around out there. At one point, when we were calculating our gains and their spending requirements related to those gains, everyone was looking at what you'd gained under House Bill 3. How much did your revenue go up compared to what it would have been in the old law? That's that column at the far right. Our estimate is about 725 based on our data, not other people's data. But the way the law is written in calculating your spending requirements, what you really need to look at is the change from 2018-19 revenue per ADA, that's the 8,963, to your new revenue under House Bill 3 per ADA, 10,212. So our revenue gain from last year or from this year to next year is $1,249 per ADA. We multiply that times our 1920 estimated ADA, that gives us a gain for the purposes of calculating our spending requirements of $52.5 million. Now what the spending requirements are is that 30% of your gain must be spent on increasing compensation to employees. So that means $15.7 million must be spent on salary increases. 75% of that 30% must be spent on salary increases for teachers, nurses, librarians, and counselors, with prioritization of differentiated compensation for classroom teachers with more than 5 years of experience. So that number is 11.8 for that designated group. Now this differentiated compensation is not teacher merit pay. That's a completely separate thing. This is salary increases for employees with, in that designated group with more than 5 years experience. Also included in the bill is the differentiated compensation called the teacher incentive allotment. That's a separate allotment where teachers with a designation of master, exemplary, or recognized based on a local appraisal system that qualifies are entitled to an allotment of an additional $3,000 to $32,000 based on the designation and the place of work of the teacher, with higher amounts awarded for teachers at a high needs or rural campus. So that's completely separate from what we're talking about here. That's that differentiated compensation for exemplary, master, or recognized teachers at high needs schools. Included in our priorities for next year is the development of a plan that meets the requirements that will be clarified by TEA in the future so that our teachers will qualify to be able to access these funds beginning in 2021. But right now, what we're talking about is the general salary increase with prioritization for teachers with 6+ years experience. So, not only do we look at spending requirements and trying to determine an appropriate amount for a raise, we look at what we have available and what we would consider appropriate levels for recruitment and retention of the highest quality staff. This district would have tried to give a raise to employees, whether the legislature says you do or not. We just have to make sure we meet these minimums. So I thought it would be useful to review where we stand right now, as well as our history of salary increases over the last 15 years. We all recall that we were unable to afford a raise in this current 18-19 year, but ALEAF is still above average and above the median at each of the markers, 0, 5, 10, 15, 20 years, based on the Region 4 salary survey. Those differences grow with our most experienced teachers. However, we are not at the top of the chart any longer either. So you can see at each level, the first one is starting salaries, then 5-year salary, 10-year salary, the districts that are currently paying above us at each of those levels. Keeping in mind, of course, that all districts are making these same decisions right now on how to adjust compensation for next year. That's the 15 and 20. Also remember that even though we do have those districts that are paying higher salaries, in some cases in our neighboring districts, our health insurance premiums are $1,000 less in this current year than employees are paying for employee-only coverage, and our employees are getting better coverage. So you remember we went through some of the changes coming in our insurance plans. There are still plan options available when employees pick those ACO plans with either Kelsey-Seybold or Memorial Hermann, where they'll be able to maintain this current premium level. So we're confident that our insurance premiums are still going to be much, much lower than our neighboring districts. So, where does this put us? A reminder, our current starting salary is $53,600. So I'm going to kind of talk through what we're showing in that 6% column there, somewhere in the middle of these numbers. The amount of a teacher raise at 6% of the midpoint for teachers with 0 to 5 years would be $3,614. If we were to pay an additional $1,000 for our teachers with 6+ years, so we're differentiating that compensation for our teachers above 5 years, and if we did that at $1,000 for everyone at 6 years and above, then their salary increase would be $4,614. Our starting salary would move to $56,900. The cost of that raise for all staff would be $19.3 million. The remaining funds, remember I said we were starting out with $33 million remaining after factoring in changes in revenue and expenditures excluding the salary increase. If we take the $33 million, subtract out that cost of a raise of $19.3, that would leave us with about $14 million. We know we have to reserve funds and not spend it on recurring expenses in order to be able to afford full-day pre-K in the future. So we subtract that $6 million out, so that would leave us with remaining funds of about $8 million. So you can see the numbers for other scenarios available on the chart. So we're still waiting for some guidance and clarification from TEA regarding all these calculations. We won't know with certainty until the end of next school year how much our revenue increase is for 1920 until we get final ADA and final counts for all these different funding allocations. When the legislature did something similar to this before, TEA issued guidance then saying, do your best to estimate these amounts right now, and there won't be any settle up in the future on your compensation increase. So based on our current estimates, we are close to meeting the spending requirements with a 5% salary increase. We're definitely well within the spending requirements with anything above that amount. So, and remember that those remaining funds, after we subtract out the pre-K reserves, that's about the amount, given that our revenue is going to stay relatively flat in 2021. Those are about the amounts that we have available, assuming all our estimates are correct and our projections are correct, potentially for a raise in 2021.
Actually, that was my question on 2021, but I think you made a comment on that one slide talking about where I think she was talking about where the $50 million you know, you came down to $33 million, and so forth. So I was kind of numbers. So I think the 2021 projected. I know there's there was an 1890 projected loss. So 2021 we would have a projected loss also.
No.
No. Okay. So that was
in 2021 we have about the same thing as we're projecting for 1920. So less whatever we give in 1920 for a salary increase.
So you should have
So we'd have the $30 million again, less whatever we carve out for a salary increase. In this year, it would happen again in that year.
Yeah, the number you want to kind of, at least in terms of, okay, what would you have for the subsequent year, is the remaining funds after you take the money out and say before they pre-K. That's what we'd be looking at. Let's just hypothetical, let's say you went with 6%, you have about $8 million left over that we could set aside. Next year, when the 2021 budget is working, assuming all these numbers stay relatively the same and we're close with our projections, and those are big ifs, but let's assume that for a second, then you'd still have another $8 million that you can continue playing with in every subsequent year until enrollment starts dropping and things of that nature.
And then we kind of talked about the pros and cons of maximizing the amount you're giving in this first year, as far as employees really feel a bigger increase more than they feel two smaller increases. Over the course of the 2 years, it's more for the employee, giving more next year. And of course, it's the competition with our neighboring districts. And I wish we knew what everybody else was doing, and like HD said, then we do $1 more than what they're doing.
And I'm not making a comment to be in favor of either way, but I know with the House Bill 3, it's more for rates for teachers, nurses, librarians, and so forth, and teachers over 5 years and so forth, and things. It didn't really have anything in there for, pairs and.
It does.
I mean, in the House Bill 3?
Yes, that 30% is
Oh,
for
has to go
all
for
staff,
all staff.
excluding
Okay.
administrators. Then from there,
75%
75% of
those
that
teachers.
30 has to go to that designated group, which once we meet the 30% test, we're always going to meet the 75% test because that's the biggest portion of our population. So once we're at the 30% with whatever midpoint range we choose, as well as giving the differentiated, the extra $1,000 for the more experienced teachers, we would be at the 30%.
So here's the deal on the $5,000 raise, because that's still the narrative by a lot of people, where's my $5,000? And I tell them two things. One, they were never going to get that $5,000. That was never going to happen. What was negotiated, if you will, and mathematically backed into was how do you get close to that while still giving districts some discretion over paras and other non-teachers. And so depending on the, and for those of you who pay attention to this, the original House Bill 3 that came out of the House only had 25% allocated. And they got into the conference committee, and there was some pretty heated discussions about where that percent should be. So it was increased to 5%, so the Lieutenant Governor would support it. But their hoping was that every district, when you do the math, would get somewhere in the neighborhood close to the $5,000 ratio. So, yeah, and we could go 7%, and we could, and we would exceed the 5,000 a couple $100. That's just decisions you have to start looking at in terms of managing your money, and is that yeah, exactly. So anyway, so for those, I know we got teachers that listen to this, and I've tried to be as clear as I could throughout the year, talking to, particularly the spring, as we got to know more about what was happening. That the 5,000 across the board for everybody, no matter whether you have 1 year or 50 years, there was never reality. That was a political point. However, it did, to the credit of teachers, it did start the discussion at $5,000. You set the negotiation point as high as you can, and from there you be real careful. So that's kind of how we're making it.
I just have one question. I know I'll stop at my question, but it's regarding, I know this had nothing to do with our incentive plans or has nothing to play with any of this for incentive plans with HR that we talked about. I know in one particular campus that's an IR, that was the big issue with their 3rd and 4th grade teachers and trying to keep them from losing the entire 4th grade team, doing some sort of incentive pay, something to keep experienced teachers at campus and things. This has none of that salary increase is even in this, is in this presentation, correct?
Correct.
Okay, so.
But what we did with those, after Elizabeth met with those individual teachers, those groups, is we gave them what they were really asking for, which was additional planning time. And that's whenever y'all modified the calendar last year. So in terms of addressing that, that was one thing we did. We have not factored that into this. We can factor that in when we get into the true discussion on merit pay.
Then on one particular campus, that was a presentation.
Yes,
At
best, I believe it was.
Is it best? And, 4th grade lost, I think everybody, I think the entire 4th grade team, B team or something, or, right?
They had indicated they were, but that's
Changed? Okay, well, I'm going by presentation, but there's a potential losing, that's what we're talking about right back to us, so.
I want to just add something too. I know the word incentive is going to come out there quite a bit, but I think that there needs to be a lot of clarification on incentive, what the state meant for incentive versus what people think that we should do for incentive. That's two different things. I know of districts where campuses that have been faced with IR and they dismissed the entire staff and brought that campus in with, I guess, this ACE thing that they are doing, and almost people are getting a certain salary. But I think one of the largest things to that for a district is to understand when you're talking about putting your quality teachers, where's your standard to say what's quality, so to speak. And I think that when the state was talking about that, and I could be wrong, Charles could help me out with that, when they talked about the incentive, it's always been about, we need some sort of measurements to justify why we're giving those dollars. So when we come up and we say, you know, we want to give incentive to keep people there, that's not what the state meant when they put that into effect.
You're exactly right. That, she covered that, touched on it a little bit, the range from 3,000 to 32,000, depending on those breaks. The commissioner has to define some standards that local districts can then use to define their plans. But if we'd had a plan ready to go, like Dallas had already been doing it, we'd already committed to that, then we could spend that money year one. But minimally, we're going to go for it for year two. And so that would be for the high needs campuses. And so we have a number of high needs campuses. So we stand to benefit the most, or more than most districts statewide.
The unfortunate part about that too is when those standards start coming out and you're saying that the campuses change because a lot of conversation goes back to your district of innovation. So if you're doing that, then some of the standards that you would have in a normal classroom setting is going to change as well. You know, even though you're not changing your Chapter 21 contract, you're still working with an understanding that if you're working on a high needs campus, in that environment, there's a certain level of expectation for you.
So yeah, there's two parts to that. I don't want to go too far down that because it's not going to be part of next year's plan, but the law says that once you earn a designation of exemplary or master, that you carry that for 5 years, and if you go from a district and a campus that's high needs that has that to another district that was applied for and still gets those funds for high needs campuses, that master goes with you for the term of that 5 years. So in other words, that's why there has to be some parity about, even though the plans are defined locally, there still has to be some across the state parity so that we're not talking apples and oranges. And I get a teacher from Midland and it's not even close to what we call a master teacher. So that's what the commissioner has to define.
And all that's in here right now as required is exactly out of the law, prioritize differentiated compensation for classroom teachers with more than 5 years experience.
I want to make one point that on the slide that shows that. Okay, the one thing I want to bring back to is on our bond sale, on our bond rating. You know, we dropped a rating because of the fact that we reduced fund balance. And so that's from dropping enrollment and enrollment projections come in. So every year we do enrollment projections, and we're forecasting a drop in enrollment next year. Not as drastic as we saw this year. Still a drop. So we want to not continue to deplete fund balance. So having that remaining funds after reserve of $5 million on the 7% column, or 7.9, while it may be used for a raise if it's there available year two, we're still heading blind somewhat into a new health plan year. We got enrollment projections, which are projections and a guess. And we're talking about a very small sliver of a large budget to hit on the nail on the head. So we don't want to set ourselves up to where we're going to potentially continue to reduce fund balance. But at the same time, knowing full well districts around us gave a raise this year and we didn't. We got to try and maximize the opportunity and get our position back. So all those battling, competing things together, looking at that $6 million this full-day pre-K that we don't need next year for full-day pre-K, we really do, because we've already analyzed our bond funds and they're not going to be enough to build the number of classrooms we need. So we could actually use that money as one-time purchases to assist in the construction or buying property if we're going to build clinical center, those kind of things. So it can still be used on full-day pre-K, just not recurring basis, and keep that placeholder in our budget for full-day pre-K, because we legally, we've got to do it.
Yeah, as long as we meet all of those other mandates that we put out there.
Yes.
Board, I'm going to ask your forgiveness and please allow, I'm going to ask, I have a member in the audience who have been with us to ask questions, and we changed the agenda so that she did not have an opportunity. She's waited tonight. I'm going to allow Ms. Pepper to ask one question as long as it's about this particular item here.
Okay. What I want to talk
This is
about.
not, this is a board, it's a board workshop, not a
Just a
regular
question.
board meeting.
While you're calculating all of these levels, I would like to say, just as an experienced teacher, 28 years now, why do we stop at 5? Why don't you give your experienced teachers another raise? There's your incentive for people to stay in the district. There's always a question about why do the people leave? Why do the new teachers come in and leave? Why do they leave? Because there's nothing to look forward to. So I think it's time for you to start appreciating that you've been in the classroom for a quarter of a century doing the work.
Thank you, Ms. Pepper. Thank you, board, for your forgiveness on that. But I know a number of times she's come to talk, and I changed the agenda where she did not have an opportunity to talk about it. So thank you.
And there are other options available other than doing the $1,000 increase for everyone with 6+. That we have calculated some other options also.
Yeah, just briefly to answer that and try and put some semblance of scope on the amount of dollars that are available to do this with. In order to give the 6+ priority and to give what we also lose the most amount of teachers from the profession in 0 to 5. And they're already on the way out the door, somewhere in that 0 to 5. They're built into the schedule. As long as we continue to give raises, there is a gap between each year of experience. The problem is we need to continue to give raises along the way. When you start spreading out increments at 10, 15, 20, 25 of $500, that's $100 a year. After tax, that's nothing. You've got to really give significant bumps at those 5-year marks, and the money just doesn't exist to give that kind of raise and satisfy giving everybody a raise in the entire teacher rank. So I wish we could do more, and I know there's probably some districts that are going to try different things with what that does in 5, 10, 15, 20. But I think the legislature looked at the basic data across the state and says, you know, the attrition rate out of the profession is in 0 to 3, specifically 0 to 5, but those first 3 years are the worst, where we lose them out of the profession completely if they can just hold on. And I don't know that $1,000 does anything with that either.
But here's the greater part of the whole story tonight. The greater part of it is we've been waiting to hear how House Bill 3 impacts us. So now we have a baseline, so to speak, to see what we're going to work with. So, you know, even with the conversation that's out there now about 5-year versus what have you, it's enough time for the board to talk about and to begin sending your information in as to your thoughts. And making sure that Deanna gets that information. That's the important piece. If the board feels, you know, a certain way, it needs to be communicated in enough time so that you can do the calculations and present.
Would love as much information as possible to move towards trying to adopt something that's a
Yeah, so wait, I'm sorry.
I was going to ask, is this other bucket of money for teacher merit pay, is that something that could be applied toward, okay, you would remember, Debbie, what did it used to be called?
Career ladder.
Thank you,
Career
career ladder, where you had certain
No.
benchmarks, you can't tie
No.
into that.
Completely different. This is more like a grant program that you apply for. You have a set plan for those
Gotcha.
high-functioning teachers to go into the high-need schools. So
That bucket of money is not going to be based on anything, not experience, not content area is going to be based on effectiveness as defined by the district. And the compensation that's going to be tied to it, it's going to be pretty meaningful. If you're a teacher that gets considered as a master teacher and you go work in a low-performing school or a challenging school, you can make $32,000 on top of whatever you're making right now. So you will have opportunities as a teacher to push the $100,000 a year, or if you're already maybe exceeding it in some cases. I want to say something real quick on the kind of what our asks are for you guys right now. What?
There's one other point I think, because we're talking about it tonight. Districts around us are talking about it in the next 10 days. Okay, everybody's trying to implement. I just want to make this one other point out. She said the percentage of our gain per ADA from one year to the next, that varies all across this region. So different districts around us are going to have less bucket, lower size of a bucket to distribute to the same number of teachers per student, if you understand what I'm saying. So this is a highly competitive window of time that we're trying to work within to come up with what we can do and what we feel is a good estimate of what revenue is going to be available.
One of the things that's happening is if you're a fiscal year, July 1, June 30th, which a lot of our neighbors are, you've got all kinds of pressure on you right now because you really are working without a safety net. We're a little fortunate in September, August. In talking to a bunch of my colleagues today this morning, we're well ahead in terms of just thoughts and ideas of where they are. The district to the west of us is, first of all, their delta between their current year and what they're going to get out of this is much lower. So they're going to be struggling to come close to being what districts like us are able to do, regardless of what we end up doing. But the other thing I want to go, something back to your point, this is just a little FYI. In the conversations about what to do, and the reason that whole year 6 and above got thrown in there was to your point, about somehow trying to recognize just folks who've been in business for quite a while, and also somehow incentivize the teacher who his or her second, third, fourth year who get ready to quit, understand money's not worth it, the job's too tough, kids are, all the reasons they leave, to see if there's a way to incentivize. And so there was a thought at one point to just incentivize year 6 through 15. Because data shows if a teacher shows up in year 16 on, they're in it for the long haul. They leave us between years 3 and 12, 13, something like that. And TSTA and AFT and others, like the Blue Gasket, on that. When you do it that way, you can concentrate a lot more money in just those 10 or 11 years. And you could make it much more significant. But then if you start backing off of years 17, 18, 19 on up, then you kind of, it was just, that's the incentive discussion was simply about keeping the folks who are years 1 through 4 or 5 in the profession. It wasn't to reward a 25-year veteran. It was about them. And so that's why they focused. Yeah, and I'm not saying it's a wrong, good thing or bad thing. I'm just telling you that's the way, that was the motivating discussion behind how does the district, where should the district put the money for year 6 and on.
Ms. Butler has something she wanted to add.
So Danny, can you go back to the slide where it talks about House Bill 3 specifically, where it talks about the salaries? So does that go into effect 1920 school year or 2021?
1920.
That's all I have.
It'll be the same 2021.
Well, it'll be the same anytime the basic allotment increases. So there shouldn't be a mandate, there won't be a mandated raise in 2021. Then the next year, hopefully the legislature will increase the basic allotment, and as long as they don't change this portion of the law, it would kick in again.
So it could be that this is what it is for now, and they not change the basic allotment for another 6 years? Or does it change? It could be.
There's no automatic change.
This
Right,
is,
because I'm like, when was the last time the basic allotment was changed? Yeah, yeah. Yeah, so people have to, understand that as well. This is not something that just because it's mandated is gonna happen, by any, no.
that's why going to the current year was a big deal, and losing the tier 2 guaranteed gift from Austin is a big deal. Those are big, those are huge. And people aren't gonna realize that if they're not realizing now, in a couple of years, they're realize.
Question I have is, question I ask every year when we talk about raises is, what's the administration's recommendation? Percentage, what we can live with, what we can't live with, going
Are
forward?
you guys ready to do that yet?
I'm just, if y'all are able, I see a bunch of numbers up there, so.
Well, here, let me say this.
Again, not bullying anybody.
Yeah, I'll be happy to answer the question on June 4th, here's what we know. I don't expect anything significant to change. I think Deanna is right, Charles is right. They've done their homework, and this is as close as reasonably possible. Go to the options, please. So 5% is probably not in the conversation, because that doesn't get us to meeting the standard. So, but we wanted to show you 5%. 5.5%, 6%, that puts us, that's gonna be hard for some of our neighbors to get to 6%, based on where they are right now, particularly those to the west and southwest of us.
So we can move on that chart again where we used to be.
Yeah, if you sit here and put a gun in my head and said, okay, what would you feel most comfortable with? Probably right now, not knowing anymore, we know 6% would be more comfortable there. Could we do 7%? And yeah, we could. Now, if there's heartburn over the thought about how we're dealing with year 6 on $1,000, or if that's gonna have our teacher groups and others upset because we're not paying more attention to that, then we may have to go back and play around with that and see if there's a way that we can do something more meaningful. But in terms of Rick, where we are right now, I wouldn't have a problem saying 6% is what my mind would be. If I were you guys, I'd just kind of start thinking along those lines and be thinking about that $1,000 for year 6 elements. If to me, that's a bigger question right now. That's as big a question as what percent do we go with. And Deanna and Charles, I'll let you guys argue with me one way or the other.
Yeah, I would like to look at some numbers on the, not just the 1,000 increase, but, you said there's some different options and some different thoughts.
Okay.
I mean, that's,
No problem.
first look at it and see.
So the other thing, I believe, I didn't research it, but I believe he hasn't signed the bill yet.
Oh, my God. All this conversation now, come on.
So we have to make
Thanks,
sure
Charles.
that's
Thanks for,
Thank you.
no, that's a very
Well,
true statement.
that's what I was like pushing for, let's adopt a salary increase as soon as possible. And she was like, wait a minute, it's not even signed yet.
before they're hatched. So anyway, but I think we could do a couple of more scenarios like with that 1,000. I just point out that when she applies it, that 1,000 at a certain level, let's say it goes to 1,100, and that's another $100 for every teacher in every one of those years that gets applied. So it's a large effect, every change that we make to that. So, but we can run some other scenarios into that table and kind of show it as alternatives to the 6, like the 6 plus or something. Anyway, but on the 18th, the goal would be that we really would like to have a decision to go forward with from the meeting of the 18th so that we can apply these with the first group of the new year without doing a retroactive raise, which is very, very difficult for staff to do.
When's he signing the bill?
And continue to
He's
match.
signing Friday, I think it's Friday.
Yeah.
Contingent, that's it.
Yeah, contingent.
And I do keep going back to this slide just because I did want to quickly point out that when you look at the difference in Ailey's salaries versus average in Region 4, the median. The differential in where we are above the average increases as we get out to our 15 and 20-year teachers. So we have put efforts there.
One thing to think about, I don't know, that you and your members would have to answer this question. But let's just hypothetically, let's say we went $1,000 in year 6 on it. If you stay in a leaf for another 4 years, that's $4,000 net over 4 years. If you stay another 5 years, every year you stay, that's an additional $1,000 that goes towards TRS and it goes towards, and it builds upon itself. It's almost like compounding. Yeah, it's really not compounding interest, but it's adding to your TRS contribution. Is the point I'm trying to make. So there is some, in addition to just the raw number, there are some other ways you can calculate that. Is over a 5-year period, that additional 5,000 is also helping in other areas. So I know that doesn't matter to a 5-year, 6-year teacher, 7-year teacher, but as you get a little bit older, it into it, you get matter anymore. So
The conversation I always get, or the comment I always get from a teacher of 15 years going, I can't believe it, I've been here 15 years, and I'm only making $3,000 more than a brand new teacher. Well, because they came in at 38.2, and now the new teacher's coming in at 53.6, and I give the same comment. I'm a paramedic for 30 years, and when I started, I was $6 an hour, and obviously salaries have gone up, but I can't compare what they're making a brand new 18-year-old paramedic versus a 50-year-old paramedic.
I always tell them,
It's tough.
yeah, but I just tell them, because I was a first-year teacher at one point, my, whatever, I was making 19 grand, whatever it was. Somebody working 25 years was only making about 5 grand more than I was. And I wasn't complaining as a first-year teacher, So we all started at some point. So at some point, we were all that 25 or 30-year teacher going, what in the world's going on here? We're going to attempt to create a little bit of division there. We'll give you some options.
Or if you don't mind, I'm going to have Jennifer, I'm looking at our times.
Just, when we're looking at raises every month, I know you're talking after Apple signs the bill. I'm looking at the remaining funds after reserve. Because it's gonna kind of be iffy this first year, what's actually gonna pay in. Do we need to be more conservative to make sure that we're not gonna be dipping into the fund balance?
Right. It does give us more wiggle room for errors in enrollment estimates or in various student counts that are factoring in all these.
You know that she's been conservative on a number of factors already.
Yeah.
Well, yeah.
Yeah. So,
I've tried to be.
but
yeah.
what I was trying to say too is that this is a head of a pin we're trying to set on top of with this size of budget and this much of a change in expenditure.
This is not an ask, it's just a wonder. Is there a way that if we maximize the extra money that we're getting per student in the basic allotment and maximize the raise based on those numbers, that we can compare what could a district west of us get based on what their projected revenue would be? So let's say we're getting $10 more, but they're getting $2.50. They can only give a raise to teachers that equals this.
Try to estimate what they're gonna give based on their.
The reason you can't do that is all of those districts have significantly higher fund balances than we do. We're talking in the hundreds of millions of dollars. South Harrison, $450 million. The ones surrounding us directly are $230, $240 million fund balances. So, and they gave a raise this year. So it doesn't, their ADA is growing. We're not.
Gotcha.
So it kind of puts us in a unique situation that it's like our pot of money is shrinking until we can get some level enrollment and less charters open up and we've got a new one opening up next year and we've got 2 on the books. So
So if we fill all the seats we have now, then we can again see growth in enrollment, the available seats.